I think the last podcast we ended after your first deployment to Iraq. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And what you
Right,
said,
right
I think,
after the first one.
and you said in that one that you basically that one mission was the only like, oh man, like fly by the seat of the pants kind of hair raising mission.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, we had that very first insert in Qasar, lost the engine, had a hard landing. It was dicey. And that was literally my first combat flight. But then, immediately went back to the ship and, started thinking about it. And I didn't want to overthink it. So I immediately was like hounding the OPSO, like, hey, I need to get back on the schedule
Mm-hmm.
right away. And he's like, you sure? I was like, yeah. So literally, they gave me one day after that one. And then the next day, I got tapped. They just put me on as a co-pilot actually with one of my peers, and we got tapped to go pick some people up in Kuwait and take them up into really the middle of nowhere in Iraq, set up an EPW camp. And in the course of doing that flight, somehow, and we didn't know exactly how when it first happened, but we were unable to transfer fuel from one of our aux tanks into our main tanks, and that just basically meant we had a fuel problem. We had 4,500 pounds of fuel we couldn't use. So we're doing the math, and it started looking like we were going to cut it really close on getting this insert done and get back down to Kuwait to where the FARP was, where we could get gas. And the short version is we ended up cutting it really damn close because it took a long time to get those guys unloaded in the zone. And the reason it took a long time to get them unloaded in the zone was because there was a team of interpreters. They only had like one or two Marines with them.
Mm.
And so they weren't accustomed to getting off an aircraft. They didn't know where they were supposed to go. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. And it took us about 30 minutes to sort that out on the ground. But that 30 minutes ended up being kind of critical to our fuel state. So we're heading back to Kuwait, and it was pretty dicey. And we literally barely made it back into the fuel pits in Kuwait, just in the nick of time to pull it off. But as we were landing, or right after we landed, we had an engine flame out. So that's how close we came. So those are my first two combat flights,
That's
and then
exciting.
and then my next one. Like 2 days later, the Marine Corps decided to move forward into Jalabah, which was a little airstrip we'd seized not too far north of the Iraqi border. And I was just doing a standard assault support request mission, moving some containers up there with supplies and gear.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was setting my load down up there at Jalabah, we lost an engine. So now I'm at Jalabah. I got to get back to the ship. I'm down an engine. Thankfully, they already had a COC set up at Jalabah, so we had some communication back with the ship. So I get in touch with my CO, my commanding officer, and I was like, "Hey, sir, like I can one shot this thing back to the boat on two motors if that's what you want me to do. I'm good with it." And that's what he wanted me to do. But it was funny because as soon as I got done with that conversation, there was a senior officer hanging out in that COC that had overheard it. And he started giving me the business, and he's like, "Hey, Captain, if you take off with two engines, that's a NATOPS violation, and I'm gonna track you down, and
What?
you're gonna be in trouble." And I was like, "Hey, sir, I don't know what to tell you. This is what my CO asked me to do. I'm gonna make it happen." And so there was thankfully another lieutenant colonel in that COC that kind of stepped in and took care of me, and I got out of there and fired up two engines and got out of Dodge, but. Those were my first three flights in Iraq, and they were all eventful for different reasons. After that, it kind of settled down some, and the war went really quick. It seemed like a couple weeks, and for the most part, all the real action was over. But we had another couple interesting flights there. But it was a good introduction into combat flying, and it was interesting because when that deployment was wrapping up, Bush landed on the carrier, we won. All of that was getting broadcast everywhere. But I just had this feeling like, I don't think so. I remember, flying out of Iraq the last time, there was a checkpoint on the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border called Budweiser. And I remember flying over Budweiser and thinking like, I have a feeling I'm going to be back here. And sure enough, we made the whole transit home, and everyone was all excited and, flag waving, and we won, etc. But our squadron was tapped to deploy again pretty quickly, like just a few months later. And because the war was supposedly over in that moment, they started the unit deployment program for Okinawa back up. So we were supposed to go back to Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually part of the advance party for that deployment. And what ended up happening was we got home from Iraq in July. I think it was October that I turned around and took off again to go on my next deployment. So I was only home for like, 3 or 4 months. Get to Okinawa with the advance parties, start turning over aircraft. And sure enough, our commanding officer calls from back here in the States and was like, hey, the rest of the squadron's going to join you in Okinawa, and then we're going to break down those aircraft and go back to Iraq. Which I was probably the least surprised person of anybody when that happened. So
But it's
that's
like,
how
here
it
we
played
go.
out.
Go
Yeah,
again.
it's like, here we go, round two.
I
Round,
wanna I wanna between that first and second deployment, you wrote in the book that on your way home you got in trouble.
I did.
You were
I
supposed to be
did.
going to WTI and stuff like
Yeah,
that, and then you had an incident.
I
Which you
did.
want to explain what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, what happened was the day that it was declared that we won the war, the day that Bush landed on the carrier, we were on a Navy ship that had taken us to Iraq and back. And there's pretty strict rules on Navy ships about that you're not allowed to drink alcohol. But on that day, because it was a huge celebration, we had what's called a beer day, which means everyone gets a couple of beers. And I would tell you that is loosely enforced as far as how those are counted. Um, but there were also several people, me included, that had, some kind of a secret stash somewhere. And as the afternoon progressed, those secret stashes started making an appearance. And yours truly, by virtue of luck or something, happened to be one of a few that were identified as breaking the rules. And, in the very beginning, I was like, this can't possibly be that big of a deal. I mean, everybody, not everybody, a lot of people were partaking, I'll say. But it did end up being kind of a big deal, and I was sweating it out there for a couple of weeks. But in the end, my only real punishment was that I stood a bunch of duty on the way home, and I ended up not going to WTI after that deployment, which at the time felt like I took that pretty hard because becoming a WTI had been a goal of mine since I started in the
Mm-hmm.
squadron. But ironically, like most things, all of that ended up working out probably better for me than anything else could have. For one, it was a great lesson to learn as a young officer,
Mm-hmm.
which was good. I ended up getting a good call sign out of it. My call sign was whiskey for that incident.
That's better than a lot. That's better than a lot of call signs.
Really, that's probably the best thing that came out of it. But ultimately, what it did is it reset me timeline wise in the squadron and gave me the ability to ultimately do what amounted to a fourth deployment later, and I ended up getting to go to WTI, et cetera. So that all shook out. But
That had to be crushing, though. I mean, because
it
you didn't
was
know
at the
you were going to
time.
go to
Yeah,
WTI later at the time. So it's easy to look back on and be like, it all worked out. But I bet at the time when you lost that spot, that was crushing. And for
it
those,
was.
can you explain what WTI is for those that don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Marine Corps has Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1, MOTS 1, we call it. It's in Yuma, Arizona. That is the schoolhouse for all upper level aviation tactics. And one of the things that MOTS 1 does is twice a year, they have a big course called the Weapons and Tactics Instructors course. And to attend that course as a student, you have to have basically every qualification other than the actual WTI qualification be nominated by your squadron, and you go out there for this course. At the time, it was a 6-week course that was 3 weeks of academics and 4 weeks of flying. But it's essentially the Marine Corps version of Top Gun, for lack of a better way to put it. So going to that course had been a goal of mine for a long time. So getting to go out there, becoming a squadron weapons and tactics instructor is a big deal. Every peer group of pilots that check into a squadron, there's usually about a dozen or so, maybe one, typically one, maybe two will achieve that qualification. So it was a big deal to have been, selected to go, and definitely crushing that when I was told I was no longer going that first time.
Yeah, that's a fleeting window.
It
You
is.
only may have one opportunity in your career to even try, and you kind of have to be the squadron golden boy to get all the flight
Yes.
hours. Like when someone's looked at, like,
Yeah.
hey, you're a WTI candidate. For those that don't know, there's so many qualifications that you can attain and that you have to obtain, and they all require flight hours, and that means time in the cockpit, and that can take away from other people's time that may not be shooting for those certain qualifications. So it's a big deal.
Absolutely. And I'd done a lot of stuff. I volunteered to do a lot of things to put myself in that position. When I was a little bit younger, when I came home from my first deployment in Okinawa, I volunteered for anything that got me flight time. So there were a couple occasions where we needed to ferry an aircraft to or from the East Coast because our depot level maintenance used to be out there, and I jumped on all of those, and it worked out well for me that my peers at the time, no one really wanted to do it other than me, just because we'd been gone so much. We're about to leave again. So I guess you could that's indicative of where my priorities were at the time. But every time something like that came up, I was like, I'll do it. So I was always, racking up hours and able to get rolling on my qualifications, which helped a lot.
Now, later on, you were a squadron CO.
Mm-hmm.
Did that event as a junior officer getting in trouble, but knowing that they could have taken it much farther, that could have been a career ender right there.
Could have.
Did that change the way you thought about like non-judicial punishments and stuff like that you were doling out as a commanding officer?
Absolutely. I would tell you, not only as a CO, but from that day forward, like it was a great example to me of there's a way to hold people accountable without ending them per se, right? And I was always cognizant of that. And I would tell you later in my career, my observation was often it was our best Marines that tend to get themselves into those situations, which is a whole other conversation. But there was definitely a linkage there that I saw. And the best way I can describe that is to say, and this is totally my personal opinion, but it's a conclusion that I came to later in my career, was that there was often a connection between Marines getting in trouble for a whole menagerie of things in their downtime, but also really being great Marines. And a lot of times it was some of our best Marines that were getting themselves hemmed up by, whatever knucklehead decision they made on a Friday or Saturday night. Mm-hmm. But the more I thought about it, the more it also became obvious to me, or I thought of it this way, like the Marines you most need on the darkest night are the same guys that are a little more likely than the others maybe to say, get in a bar fight on Saturday night, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not an accident. It's kind of who they are and how they're wired, which in some ways is a superpower, and in other ways those are strings that are a detriment that they have to try to constantly combat within themselves. And I would definitely classify myself as a Marine that was squarely in that group.
Yeah.
From the time I was a young officer, and I was aware of it.
I remember when I was at 10th Marines, I believe it was at 10th Marines, we had a guy who he got either meritorious corporal or meritorious sergeant. I can't remember which one it was. 1 month. And then the next month he got a DUI. And he requested a public NJP. So now they did this public NJP in front of the battalion of this guy that the previous month had been getting meritoriously promoted. And he said he did it, like, hey, I wanted people to see from my mistake and learn from it. And I was like, oh, this was like, I'd never seen a public NJP before. I'd never even seen an NJP before because I'd never been in trouble. And I'm like, this is kind of crazy. And so it kind of takes to your, what you're saying there, your sentiment there that, the best guys are like, they kind of live life on the edge, and it's pretty easy to step over that line.
It is for sure. And, as I would say, as my career progressed in the Marine Corps, the rules became a little more stringent to try to prevent those things. But certainly later in my career, especially as a CO, the Marines that ended up in my office because they had, misstepped more often than not were some of our better players. And I understood that and how they got themselves into that situation and why. And I always made an effort to try to help them understand that. And we would still hold them accountable, but I was definitely not somebody that was spring-loaded to throw the book at anybody, especially if it was a scenario like that, and especially if it was call it a first-time issue. Mm-hmm. Repeat issues is kind of a different thing, but the first time, I would say a lot of Marines would probably say I was a little soft in that respect, but I always thought of it as I was coming from a place of understanding and wanting to hold them accountable without, just totally making it a career ender for anybody.
Was there during that time, during the GWAT, was there any pressure on not like getting guys kicked out to commands because of like the need for people?
Not in particular. And I was certainly fortunate in that, when I screwed up, it was at a time when those rules hadn't gotten as stringent yet. I mean, if I'd have done the same thing, geez, 2, 3, 4 years later, it might have been extremely detrimental for me. Um, but at the time, I don't specifically remember, say, a desire or need to sort of let things slide. But at the time, also, we had, the recruiters like were kicking people out of their offices because 9/11 was still kind of fresh and everyone wanted to be in the Marine Corps and retention was good. We had a lot of people that wanted to be involved in those conflicts and what we're doing.
Yeah. I remember the only reason I asked is I remember, and this is funny because I was just talking to a guy about this the other day. When I was a mechanic, there was a kid that joined, and he had only been with us for like 6 months or something like that. And he's super motivated, like seemed like a really good dude. And he popped for coke on a piss test. And
Whoa.
I was like, "Oh, you're out of here, dude."
Yeah.
And no, they didn't. They did a company level NJP. I think he got 45, which is, for those that don't know, it's 45 days of restriction, meaning he has to live in the barracks. He can't really go anywhere from the barrack, go to work, come home, kind of deal. And 45 days of extra duties around the compound, like cleaning and mowing and shit. And in that period, that 45 period when he was on restriction, which again, we were all like, "Holy crap, I can't believe you didn't get kicked out." Like, especially for coke, like that's crazy. And what it was is, what do they call that? Where they suspend your sentence or whatever, basically, where like, hey, don't get in trouble again. But if you do, we're bringing this other stuff back up.
Yep.
And he got in trouble again. While he was on restriction, there was a female. When I was at the barracks, or when I was at maintenance battalion, they had restriction Marines live in the duty hut, had a room to the side that was like a small squad bay that had bunks in it. And I think males and females had to hang out there during the day, and then at night they separated them. But he got caught messing around with the female Marine that was also on restriction, and she was a sergeant. He was like a PFC, and she was married. And so anyways, he got in trouble again, and they started processing him to kick him out, which it takes a little bit. And in that process, this is morbidly funny part of the story. During that process, he comes in one day and he's like, "Hey man," he was talking to me. He's like, "Hey, I got like a lump on my testicle." And I'm like, "What? Like, what are you telling me for, dude? Like, go to medical, And that's like, everybody's like, "Dude, go to medical. What are you talking about?" Goes to medical. They're like, "Hey man, you might have testicular cancer. You need to go to the base hospital," whatever. They determine they're going to have to remove his testicle to do a biopsy and stuff like that. Remove the dude's testicle. It's not cancer. It was just a cyst. And then like the day after they took his testicle out, they gave him his 10-day letter. So 10 days later, he was out of the Marine Corps. I was like, "Dude, you got kicked out and a nut taken." It's like, don't do drugs while you're in the Marines, man. It can get squirrely out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, drugs were always kind of a slam dunk. But, Marine Corps, most of what we saw were what later came to be known as alcohol-related incidents. I don't even remember the first time I heard that term. I think I was a pretty senior captain, maybe even a junior major. But it's probably good for me that term didn't exist when
I was going to say,
a younger captain.
In the book, you're pretty open about drinking quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way I wrote the book, and I made a decision going into it that I needed, or it was important to me to be brutally honest about everything. It was important to me to capture like a really accurate picture of what it was, no revisionist history, especially not with any temptation to make myself sound better, look better, etc. Like it is what it is. I did what I did. Some of that was good. Some of it was not good. But, at that time, in the squadron, that's just kind of how it was, and it's easy to look back on it now and say like, "Oh, we shouldn't have done that," or "It probably shouldn't have been that way," but it just was like, that was the culture in the squadron when I walked in the door, and I was 100% all about it. I was one of those like, "Yeah, this is great."
Let's party.
It was the epitome of work hard, play hard all the time.
Yeah, I don't think it's probably like that as much anymore, but it's still, they definitely still have fun.
For sure. Yeah,
I think even when I was getting out, I think I even remember squadron still having like a squadron vehicle, that they would use like for the DD had to drive all the drunk captains around,
Yeah. Yeah, that's still a thing. I mean, there's still a lot of fun things that happen. It just, things change over time, and I think every generation of Marines looks back on, looks at the current Marines and is like, oh, back in our day it was so much better and we had so much more latitude to do things. But we definitely did. But at the same time, I remember being, a junior captain and the majors complaining about how much it sucked in because it used to be so much more fun when they were captain. So it
Yeah.
wasn't anything new. It just slowly got more and more and more in the box over
Hmm.
time. It
Well, I
was
mean,
still
you
a
look
little out
back,
of the box.
you look back and Vietnam, they were drinking beer in Vietnam. You know, they were all
Yeah,
they had their own like stash of beer and everything like that they would drink,
absolutely.
and it was okay. It was delivered to them,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you are in trouble for stashing a bottle. You know, like
Yeah.
it's funny. I remember guys. I remember the first time when I was in Iraq for my first deployment. A couple of the dudes got super drunk. Someone had gotten alcohol or something sent to them, and a couple of the dudes got super drunk, and I was just like, dude, this is like the worst place to be drunk. Like, what are you? And don't get me
Agreed.
wrong, I wasn't in some shithole. I was in TQ, living in like
Yeah.
they had like what do they call them? They're like quad cons, but like containers,
Yep.
basically
I know what you're
container
talking about.
housing. Yeah. And I'm like, this seems like the worst place to do this. And I had a family and shit, and I was like, nah. I mean, I had gotten in trouble enough trying to get into the Marine Corps that I was like, I'm not risking anything. So I was like,
Yeah.
I'm good, guys. You guys drink it up. That's how. And I saw that a couple times, on in Iraq when I was on ship. I didn't really see it in Afghanistan, although we did have a guy when I was with 3-6. I got caught smoking weed with the Afghans, I believe, and I think they detained
Hmm.
him as soon as we got home, kind of deal. It was like,
That's wild.
yeah. So some people
I would
still try to
also
do it.
I would also say on that first deployment to OIF, it was such an unknown
Hmm.
that none of us were as concerned about the rules as we should have been. I mean, it's like we're going off to this giant war. Who knows how many of us are going to survive? Like, am I really that concerned about getting in trouble for having some alcohol?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's not like we were doing it in country or when we were flying. Or I mean, everyone just kind of had this little stash for like when the war was over, and that was the day the war was supposedly over, and we won, and it was time to have our little party. And but definitely great lesson learned.
For
Great lesson
sure.
learned.
Did you now in your preparation? You get told. You said while you're in Okinawa, like, hey, we're not doing the UDP anymore. The deployment to Okinawa. We're going to go to Iraq. Um,
Yep.
how long was it between that period and when you went to Iraq? And what kind of like training could you do with the new pilots that hadn't been there yet?
It was really difficult. So what had happened was because we got put back in the UDP rotation, essentially what typically happens is you chop out a SoCal MEU here in San Diego. So 25% of your squadron and 4 of your aircraft, they're not going with you to begin with. And then the plan is as soon as you arrive in Okinawa, you chop another 25% of the squadron and 4 more aircraft over to the 31st MEU, which is based out of Okinawa. And the remaining 50% of the squadron, we call a point 0.5, would stay there in Okinawa and just basically train and do, for the most part, the same kind of stuff you do at home, which is what we done on my very first deployment. But in this case, we got tapped to take that point 0.5 to Iraq. And at the time, I didn't really understand why. Like, I wasn't surprised that we were going, but we had also been told that there was a full 1.0 full squadron from Miramar that was going to go straight to Iraq and get there shortly after us. So there would be 1.5 squadrons there. And later, I came to understand that the idea was the Marine Corps was basically at that time we went back into base, establish all the fobs, get the laydown done. And so the Marine Corps wanted to have another essentially 853s in country to help with just the logistics of that, which
Mm-hmm.
made total sense. It definitely makes sense in retrospect. But at the time, I was still kind of a mid-level captain. I didn't totally understand that big picture. I don't know that even, anyone in our squadron did. It was just like, hey, you guys are going to break these planes down and go. But I got to Okinawa advanced party in October, and our main body showed up, a couple weeks later, and then it was this ridiculous, frustrating back and forth that went all the way through the holidays. Like, we're going, but we don't know when. First Marine Aircraft Wing is in charge of all the assets in Okinawa to include the deployed units. They wanted us to do some pre-deployment training exercise, which to us, we were like, what are you talking about? We're already on deployment.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, people were just creating boxes for us to check as a squadron. My words, my opinion at the time as a captain for these things. After a bunch of back and forth, shortly after the first of the year, we finally broke the aircraft down, put them on C5s, and went back into Iraq. And at that point, we ultimately settled in to the main Marine Corps air base that would remain the main Marine Corps air base through the rest of the war at Al-Assad.
Al-Assad.
So we were in the.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying we were the first wave of Marines to arrive at Al-Assad to take over from the army, who had been there for about a little over a year, I think, at the time.
Yeah, Al-Assad wasn't bad. I flew there. I was there later on, like 2009. I flew there from TQ for like a week to get my eyes checked or something, but it was like a movie theater. I saw the Wolverine origin story movie in a theater there at Al-Assad.
That's funny.
Yeah. Like it was crazy seeing how much stuff, because it was an established base by the Iraqis already. So it had all kinds of stuff in it already.
It did.
I wanted to touch on, in the book you mentioned on your way there, you guys stopped off in Dover and you saw one of the dignified, transfer remain ceremonies. What was that like?
I would say it was a moment for our first time deployers that hadn't gone to us or gone to Iraq with us the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually kind of random that we ended up there. The aircraft that we were on, the C5, had to divert to, I think it was get a flap check. So we were all, we got off the aircraft and we were kind of standing around. But at that point, we had half a squadron, and there were only a few of us, interestingly, that had been with the squadron when we went to Iraq the year prior. So everyone else was new. We had a few majors that were new, that hadn't, participated in flying in the war at that point. Our commanding officer had not participated in flying in the war at that point. And then we had all these young pilots that were on their first deployment. But I think really what that did was just kind of hammered home to everybody, like, hey, what we're about to go do is real. Mm-hmm. And there are real consequences associated with this. And it was a very sobering moment, I think, for our young pilots. And I remember going straight into kind of big brother mentor mode as we were there at Dover to kind of help them, move past that. But it was definitely a moment for them.
I had a couple moments like that. Well, one, I remember on my third deployment, we flew in to Leatherneck, and we got off the bird, and we were kind of waiting on our bag. We were like moving bags and stuff and waiting on our follow-on transport. And we were standing there, and 3 medevac choppers took off, from the flight line. And one of the lieutenants, this was his first deployment, he was like, oh, I wonder if they're going to go do some training or something like that. And I'm like, sir, training's over, man. I was like, that's real. I was like, whatever's happening is real, And then we got a rocket attack like an hour or two later on the base. And I was just like, this is it, And it was kind of the same kind of deal. You see, it's like, oh, it kind of clicks in people's minds like, oh, okay, this is for real. And then a couple days later, me and I grabbed, or maybe it was the next day, my corpsman, I was like, hey, man, let's go over to the squadrons. I had just gotten the tablet, I was using PAVE or whatever the program was called at the time before I don't even remember anymore, Kill Switch. And I went over to the skid squadron to get the updated map data and I brought my corpsman so we could go and talk to the medevac pilots, also the Pedro guys. And when we were walking over there was a mass CAS coming in off of Chinook in the medical area, and I guess like a car bomb had gone off, and we sit there and watch them just offload like a bunch of people. And I was like, damn, dude, like, here we go.
Oh, wow.
Man. And this was, and that was our moment, like, oh, here we go. And this was my corpsman I was walking with. This was his third deployment and his third time to Singen. And I was like, dude, like, this is about to be crazy. So it's weird how those little moments really kind of make your mind, little something switches in your mind, and you're like, all right, this is for real now.
Definitely. It definitely does.
Yeah. Now, when you got to Iraq, was this the deployment that you took over from the Army for when you guys got there?
Yeah, so the Army had been on Al Assad since we had seized it, or since the United States had seized it. And this was like the handoff to the Marine Corps, where then it kind of became the Marine Corps logistical hub for the rest of the war. So it was really interesting turning over with them. And at the time, there was a lot of debate about aviation tactics, specifically what altitude to fly at, because our survivability gear at that point wasn't great. And so we were countering the threat for the most part by flying low altitude, terrain flight altitude 200 feet below. And the Army had experimented some with raising their altitude, really to avoid obstacles, because you're trading one threat for another, right? Like a man-pad shot is less likely down low, but there were so many power lines that were painted the same color as the desert and all these other things that could get you, that they had toyed around with going up, I want to say between 300 and 500 feet, and they had lost some aircraft and recently made a decision to come back down. So they're, to a lower altitude. So the Marine Corps was having the same debate kind of as we were taking over for them. What is the right altitude? And we ended up bumping it up to 300, just a little bit to give ourselves a little more room for error. But to me at the time, I felt like 200, 300, there's very little difference between those two numbers on a low light level night in a helicopter. I mean, maybe you bought yourself one more second, from impact if you get disoriented, but not a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, low altitude's low altitude.
You talked about doing the turnover in the book, and I wanted to read this part because it was I was like, wow, that's crazy. So this is from the book. It says, they had just lost another OH-58 and its crew the day prior. The effects of that were evident in their demeanor, but they were total professionals about helping us get snapped in. A couple of weeks before leaving Okinawa, I saw a quote from a Marine general in Stars and Stripes that essentially said the Marines wouldn't lose as many aircraft as the Army because we were going to do it different. In our opening brief, an Army warrant officer read that quote and followed with, "Good luck. I never felt like a bigger asshole for being a Marine."
Yeah, I'll never forget that. And I did. I felt like a total asshole. And, I didn't say it, but I remember when I'd read it thinking like, that's, no matter what you think, I mean, it's just one of those things. Like, we work so closely with the Army and the sister services. It is what it is.
Yeah, how are you going to degrade what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, they're great. I mean, they're just as good as anybody else. They're obviously doing the best they can, making the best decisions possible, and had really been doing some experimentation with, well, what's the right answer? Are we going to be 200 feet and below to counter the man-pad threat and deal with the power lines and the other threats? Or are we going to go ahead and bump it up a little so we avoid power lines? But there was no right answer. There really wasn't. I mean, we didn't have the right answer either, frankly. Everyone was kind of working through it simultaneously. But I remember when the warrant officer read that, I just felt bad. And I also felt bad just because I felt for them. I mean, I knew they just lost the aircraft the night prior, but they were so professional that they're still there giving us these briefs. They're trying to do a great turnover, and they did, and so I was really impressed with them, but to hear him say that, it hurt a little. I felt bad. Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, you had seen that quote already. I wonder if there were other guys that hadn't seen that quote yet, and then he read it and they're like, what the, like,
I'm sure there were. Yeah.
That's one of those things where like, it's a fun rivalry to like, mess around with each other about being in different services and stuff like that. But man, to start, unless you got like hard facts that someone messed something up, to start questioning like guys, reasonings or whatever they did in combat, that, getting killed and stuff, that's a bad look. That's a bad road to go down. And that general, I don't know who it was, but man, what a dick for doing that, because I'm sure a lot of soldiers read that and were like, fuck this dude,
Yeah. And the truth is, I don't remember literally who it was either, but I wrote the quote down in my journal. I was like, I can't believe this guy said this, because I felt bad just reading it. And then, I mean, like I said, there's no right answer. Everyone's doing the best they can do. So
what are you going to do? Yeah. What are you going to do, man? I mean, it's another thing I thought was interesting in the book. You talked about the establishing combat crews for deployment. A lot of people don't understand this. They see, outside of the military, they see like aircraft with like a captain's name on it and whatever.
Yeah.
And they think that that's their plane that they fly all the time. Can you kind of explain like the combat crew and also the artwork that you guys create?
So we always had combat crews, but that didn't necessarily mean we flew together all the time or in those assigned aircraft. In a 53 squadron in particular, what it really was that combat crew, which was usually a pilot, co-pilot, and a head, the primary crew chief, were assigned to a specific aircraft, and we had specific responsibilities for that aircraft where we'd go out and do inspections, clean the cabin, things like that. It just kind of gave everybody some ownership over an individual aircraft. And then, those are the ones they put our name on the side, and the crew chief got to decide what door art went on the crew chief's door. But in actual execution, more often than not, the crews were just whatever made sense for what was happening. And there was some rhyme or reason to that, but it was very rarely our combat crews, at least in the 53 community. Same with the aircraft. We flew whatever aircraft made sense for our maintenance department for us to fly. It was more common, I think, especially during OIF-1 and like the skid squadrons, where like the Cobras and Hueys, they had like full divisions of combat crews of the same. 8 pilots would be out there together as a flight of 4 every day, and that was really a lot of that was predicated on response time, because they're familiar with each other, they know each other, they've briefed this stuff 100 times, so they're able to move more quickly, react more quickly, and in a dynamic environment where they're out there in a gunfight, it was just orchestrated better because they were all so familiar with one another.
Yeah. Another question before we get to actions in Iraq is why the quick turnaround for your squadron to deploy? I mean, there's multiple 53 squadrons, there's multiple. Like, why? I didn't really understand that at the beginning of the war, why there was a quick turnaround for these units to deploy and then come home. And you were home, I think you said 5 months, and then went back, right?
Yeah, not quite. So basically what had happened was for OF1, we had 2 full 53 squadrons there. I was an HMH 465, and HMH 462 was also there. HMH 466 had actually been deployed to Okinawa before OAF started, and they extended them. So they ended up staying there for almost like around a year. The 4th 53 Squadron, the last one available at the time, was HMH 361. And the decision was made at higher headquarters. Basically, they'd farmed some of their pilots out to the other 3 squadrons. They weren't ready to go. They weren't in a situation where that squadron was formed up and ready. They'd kind of been the rear element back at Miramar while all this other stuff was going on. So really, it was either going to be us in 465 or 462 that needed to go and deploy next. And for whatever reason, we just drew the short straw or whatever and ended up being the first ones back out the door. So it was a very short stop at home before we went right back to Okinawa, then ultimately Iraq.
But you're only talking about West Coast squadrons, right? Aren't there there's more squadrons on the East Coast? Why didn't they get pulled in?
Yeah, well, at the time it was all, one MEF out here on the West Coast. That was the lead effort there. And the East Coast had a MU that participated in the initial invasion of Afghanistan. But they hadn't jumped in, and they also had a squadron in OIF-1, HMH 464, but they had not jumped back into the rotation at that time. And it really stayed an all West Coast rotation from that point. I don't remember the year that ended, but it was all West Coast show the rest of the time I was in the fleet, up through crazy. Like 2006, 2007. It was the 4 West Coast squadrons that were doing the Iraq rotations. And the East Coast actually got involved in the mission over in Djibouti. So they were doing deployments to Djibouti while the West Coast 53 units were deploying to Iraq.
Ooh, which one would have been a better one to have? Because Djibouti missions are like, you get rolled into SOCOM a lot and do missions with those guys.
Yeah, for sure. But it was interesting because I had peers in my peer group on the East Coast who never deployed to Iraq. And I went to Iraq 3 times. So it was just total happenstance of where you happened to be and what squadron on what coast, what you ended up doing.
That's crazy. Yeah. I don't get that. I feel like, why lock it? I get 1 MEF or, 1st Marine Division is the headquarters unit in charge at the time, but when you're dogging dudes out 5 months between deployments, that's crazy. Yeah. That's like, I don't know.
It was. Well, after that, we got the quick turn, and then it settled in where the squadrons were all rotating on a more even cadence. But
was it like 1-to-1, or did you have a little bit more?
It ultimately got to where it was 1 to 2.
Okay.
So I ended up being home, I want to say for almost a year between the second and third trip to Iraq. But, during that time I was, went to WTI, I was on training deaths. So even then I wasn't home much.
That's the hard part about getting those like advanced certifications and stuff like that is the training to get ready for it. You're gone a lot. And then once you get it, you're like, I've achieved this, WTI or whatever.
Yep.
And now it's like, hey, WTI, we need you on this training exercise because you're the expert. Come on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I felt that as a JTAC evaluator. For a little while, I was gone so much. I was away from home for sure more than I was at home. I'm talking like sometimes 2 to 3 weeks a month gone to different training
Yep.
ops and field ops and stuff like that because that's the job. But I loved it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did too. But it was certainly a trade-off. I mean, for those roughly 3 years I was in Iraq, I think I figured it out at one point in time, and I had literally been home for like 6 out of 36 months. Like by the time you did all the math and
That's
included the
crazy.
training detachments and everything else. Yeah, it was a crazy 3 years for
Yeah,
sure.
people forget about the training part because that's like if you go on a MEU, you have 7 months of training for the MEU, and those include
Yeah.
three times on ship that are a couple weeks each, and
Yep.
field ops and everything else. It's like it's just being tapped for deployment means you're about to be gone a lot, even when you haven't left yet.
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a tough turn.
Um. Now, when you guys were in Iraq, you guys were running a lot of missions and doing stuff. In the book, you had this part where you talked about that there was a all officers meeting. Is that an official thing where you guys came? You guys
Yeah.
came together to. I guess people complained about they thought the CO was dangerous or whatever.
They did.
How is
Yeah,
that even? Was the CO
and
present for this meeting?
he was not. He was not. So our CO on that deployment, I actually really like. I personally really liked him. But he was kind of one of those classic Marines. It was that we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
Guy's a good pilot, went hard, and was a little bit of a liberty risk, if you will. Um, and he had actually been part of the MEU that had done the initial invasion into Afghanistan a few years prior. So we're talking about an experienced, pretty salty guy, but it was a combination of things, in my opinion. We're a point five, so it's half a squadron. Most of the pilots in the squadron are in Iraq or in combat for the first time, and we've got this CO he was pushing hard. He was pushing really hard, and it was making some people uncomfortable. So all officers meeting is a pretty standard thing. We call them an AOM. When for the most part, they're administrative in nature, and we do them, once a week, once every other week, just to talk about whatever needed to get information got passed. But in that specific case, what had happened was a couple of our younger pilots had gone and complained to our flight surgeon, who then talked to our executive officer, who's the number two guy in charge. So it was our XO who rounded everybody up, and the ready room for a kind of an impromptu AOM was like, okay, what's the problem? Like, what are your complaints? And a few of the pilots, junior pilots, spoke up and said they had some concerns, felt like we were pushing too hard.
In what
But I was
ways?
Well, it was just stuff like weather calls, right? You got borderline weather sometimes. Do you go? Do you not go?
Hmm.
And RCO at the time was definitely someone that was like, you go. And we had pilots that weren't comfortable with that. And that's not knocking anybody. Everybody's box is a little bit different size, and there's things some pilots are comfortable with and others aren't quite there yet. And sometimes that's just a function of experience. But he was really pushing us to fly as many hours as we could. He wanted us to, not be turning around because the weather might get bad. And to be honest with you, it really didn't faze me too much, because I had a similar aggressive style, especially as an aviator. The only thing I kind of had a hard time with sometimes at the time as a young captain from where I was sitting was I understood the maintenance department and how that worked. And I knew if we flew too many hours, it was going to be really difficult for the maintenance department to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a math problem. But that was the only thing that made me a little bit concerned. But he was a character, and it made some folks uncomfortable, and so we had a conversation. But our XO was an awesome guy, and he did a great job with that. And I think from that point forward, it was like, okay. I think, everyone got to say their piece and then we kind of moved on.
Is that's not a Marine Corps wide kind of thing, right? This all officers meeting, or is that just
Yeah, all the squadrons do them at least for sure.
yeah?
It's a pretty routine thing to get all the officers together, and for the most part, again, it's like administrative in nature, and every department gets up and says, "Hey, here's what's going on," whatever, things everyone needs to know. That one in particular in Iraq was impromptu,
That seems.
for that reason.
I mean, that seems crazy, right? Your
Yeah.
borderline mutiny over here from your junior
I remember
pilots.
and actually, it really, me personally, and I talked about it in the book, like I just didn't say anything, but I certainly wasn't of that same opinion. I felt like, hey, we're here to support the Marines on the ground, and sometimes that means we have to push it, like, play to win, like whatever those guys need, that's what we're here to support. So I'm certainly not going to be one to be making borderline safety calls if the Marines out there that we're supposed to be supporting need something. I'm going.
Hmm.
And in fairness, I was probably similar to the CO we had at the time, one of those guys that would push it
Hmm.
for sure. But I was comfortable doing that.
Why would they go to the flight surgeon? Why would multiple people go to the flight? Was it just a trusted person within the command, or was it like?
Basically, yeah, trusted, nonpartisan.
Mm.
He's not he's on the team, but kind of a pilot, but not the same as
I was gonna say
everyone
that
else.
seems like a kind of a weird angle to take.
Yeah.
Like, go to the flight surgeon
It
and
was, but
complain.
yeah, and at the time, our flight surgeon, he was actually an awesome guy, like one of my favorite flight surgeons, just a great dude. And so he had a good rapport with everybody, and I think
Hmm.
that was part of it too. He was someone they trusted, and he had a good rapport with them, and he didn't go to the XO like, oh, we have this huge problem. It was more of a, hey, sir, just so you know, this is something that's getting talked about a little bit. And the XO called AOM really just to kind of squash it and
Hmm.
like, hey, we're all here. Let's get on board and let's do what we're here to do.
Now, was it before or after that meeting that you got caught in like a sandstorm as you were flying?
It was not too long after that, and it was randomly. I was with our commanding officer, so in different aircraft. So he had a young co-pilot in his aircraft. I had a young co-pilot in mine, out on just a routine night flight, and we had gone down to TQ, which you're familiar with, not too far from Al Assad. And we were like running supplies basically back and forth from Al Assad to TQ, and we were heading back towards Al Assad. And the co-pilot I was flying with, I was like, "Hey, let me take the controls for a minute." And I was just going to demo something for him. And like right, like seconds after I took the controls, it was like everything went haywire. And our commanding officer was in front of us in what we call the dash one position. So I was flying formation off of him. But as soon as it happened, I wasn't sure for the first couple of seconds what had happened because all of a sudden we just could see nothing. The gauges are going haywire. The aircraft's bouncing all over the place. I'm looking at my radar altimeter and it's just like doing this, like between 300 feet, 100 feet. And I pretty quickly figured out, like, oh, wow, we ran into a haboob, which are those basically giant Iraqi sandstorms that would kick up. And it's basically just like a wall of dirt. But because it was nighttime and low light level, which means there was no moon whatsoever to illuminate, we never saw it coming. And flying low light is difficult under any circumstances, but hitting that haboob was dicey. And I ended up just getting real close to the CO who was in dash one. I just tightened up the form as much as I could. I was probably a rotor, maybe a hair less, where we typically fly more like 2 to 3, in a tight parade position, and just stayed with him. And, if you looked at our track over the ground afterwards, I'm sure it looked like a roller coaster because it was
Hmm.
climbing, descending, turning, just really fighting through it. Took us about 15 minutes to get back to Al Assad. And at the time, that 15 minutes to me felt like it was 2 hours. But the co pilot I was flying with was definite. He did a great job of giving me talkies and stuff, but it definitely scared the hell out of him
Yeah,
for
you,
sure.
you said he requested a transfer out not too long after that.
Yeah, it was not too long after that he actually elected to not fly. And right after the flight, he said that to me. He's like, "I'm never doing that again." And I was like, kind of just, yeah, I don't really want to do that again either. And he's like, "No, I'm never flying one of these again." And I knew he was freaked out. And I understood. He was a young guy. He was barely qualified to be on the flight, at the time. And it had been a bit of a white knuckle event. But he ultimately decided not too long after that that, yeah, he was going to change his military occupational specialty and do something else when we got home. And he ended up not flying for the rest of the deployment. I think he flew like a couple more times after that one flight. I can't remember exactly, but then he stopped and we got home. He went through with it.
How does that affect you on a deployment? I mean, now you're down a pilot, right? I mean,
It did. I mean, it was a little tight, but we had a little bit of wiggle room based on our tasking. And you need pilots every day on the schedule to do other things like fill duty slots and things like that. So he stayed extremely helpful. Great dude. He did what we needed him to do to help the team. He just didn't want to get back out there specifically at night again anytime soon. And that was the first time. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that.
no.
Just or, well, I would say that not the first time I'd seen someone on a flight that just was too much. They just got overwhelmed and was like, holy shit, like, I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah.
It happens. And it especially happens to pilots who are younger, more junior. You get into a situation that's extremely hairy and walk away from it. It has an effect on people. That especially that very first time you realize like, wow, like that we could have died and maybe we should have. It's kind of a miracle that we didn't. Like when someone processes that for the first time, it's just impossible to know how it's going to affect them and how they're going to react.
If a pilot decides to, give up flying, how hard is that of a transfer out into another MOS?
It's actually pretty straightforward when it happens. I saw it a few times over my career, and they just end up, they reach out to the monitor and let them know, and there's a paperwork drill that happens, and the monitor finds, another military occupational specialty for them that makes sense, and they go take off and do that. And in a lot of cases, it ends up working out okay for them, especially if they make the decision fairly early in their career.
Mm. Do they still wear their flight wings after that? Their aviator wings?
If I remember correctly, there's a process in which they determine whether that's a yes or no. And more often than not, though, they are still allowed to wear their wings.
I feel like I remember working with a guy briefly that had aviator wings, but someone told me that I was like, why is he over here? Like, what's he doing over here? And
yeah.
I think this is when I was a mechanic, and someone was like, yeah, he was a pilot and he quit. I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, it's like a thing. And I'm like, oh shit. Like that's,
yeah.
I mean, I get it. I wouldn't want some dude flying me that doesn't want to be there. So
yeah, 100%. I mean, and that's really the thing that makes the decision. Like, if you're not 100% certain that's what you want to be doing, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So I never knock those guys at all. It's a personal decision for everybody, for certain. And Lord knows it's crazy as hell sometimes out there.
Yeah.
I just happen to be one of those weirdos that not only did I not mind it, I kind of liked it. Like all that crazy shit was like, I was good with it. Like I'd go out there every night if they let me.
You're like, oh, I can make this happen. It's fine.
Yeah, I was all about it. Like,
yeah, I mean, you kind of have to be in some situations, man, when you're talking about flying in combat, especially if you're on missions where you're doing hot LZs or something like that, when you're flying in and you're going to be getting shot at. Aircraft are such big targets. It's like every time you come into what could be a potentially, hot LZ or an actual one where there's active engagements happening. I mean, that's so dangerous for the air crew, like the pilots and the crew chiefs and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just so many things that can go wrong under the best of circumstances. But, toss in the enemy, terrain, obstacles, the weather, a million parts all made by the lowest bidder. All those things get a vote.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of shit that can go wrong on any given day and often does. So it takes a certain mentality to be okay with that and to navigate that and be fine going out there over and over and doing it. But you definitely get yourself into, I want to call it a combat mindset where you kind of have to believe you're 10 feet tall and bulletproof to go do that stuff night after night.
Mm-hmm.
And,
you're fighting against the law of averages,
For sure. And I will tell you, and I'll freely admit this, like I was fairly certain for a long time, like, one of these days I'm probably going to be a half second too slow. And for whatever reason, I was strangely okay with that. It was just sort of this fate that I had accepted for, the life that I'd chosen for myself. But I was aware of it, but I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it or hemming and hawing about it. And I definitely never worried about it. It was just sort of this accepted reality. Like, if you're going to live in this world and do this super dangerous job, for lack of a better way to put it, like, you need to understand that that can obviously happen and be able to go do the job anyway.
Yeah. I mean, at least in something of, man, at least it'd be almost instant and something like that, probably, like when you're crashing a helo
Yeah.
or something. God. I don't even want to think about it. That sucks. I remember I
It
never thought
does.
about flying ever or having issues with it until I was we talked about it last episode when I was on a
Yeah.
53 flying from San Clemente Island, and it lost like the hydraulic stabilization or whatever and was flopping all over the place. And I'm like, what the fuck are we doing, dude? And then after that, every time I got on a bird, I was
Yeah.
like, man, I hope this one doesn't
Yeah.
mess up. And then we had an Osprey go in the water when I was on the 11th MEU and the crew chief passed away.
Yeah. I remember that one too.
Yeah, it's like, dude, when shit like that happens, you're like, damn, man, like, it just, I think we talked about it on the last episode, and I've talked about it on a lot of episodes, but it's a reminder about how dangerous the job is, even when you're doing, in your own mind, you're doing something that's routine. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? Like,
for sure.
this is an administrative movement. This is a whatever. Makes it sound very mundane. But if you're like moving an aircraft, at any point, that thing could go down. And
Yep.
a 53 is like 50,000 pounds. So the auto
Yep.
rotation is probably not the greatest in something like that.
It's not. It really isn't. And, in the combat environment too of 53, and we were well aware of it as the salt sport guys, it's a strategic target because
Mhm.
the enemy assumes that you got 20 plus Marines in the back of that thing. And if they can take it down, then that's a huge strategic win, especially when you're fighting an insurgency. So, you're a target every time you're out there doing anything you're doing, and then those other things can get you too. But it was a ridiculous way to live for a long time, for sure.
Can you tell us about, I think on that deployment you did Op Rawah as well, correct?
Yeah, there towards the end, which was cool because up until that point, for the first, I would say, several weeks of the deployment, the Marine Corps as a whole was really just reestablishing themselves in the battle space, setting up forward operating bases. So a lot of what we were doing was just moving gear and people around and getting those set up. So people were getting frustrated for sure, like guys in our squadron. The stuff started coming up like, well, what are we even doing here? We're just moving shit around. Like, when are we going to do something real? So it was good. It was towards the tail end of that deployment that essentially the logistical lay down was settling and almost complete. And so then we started doing operations. And for that one, we got paired up with the other 1.0 squadron that was there at the time. Next door to us was HMH 466. So we flew a mixed division. So a flight of four, two from us, two from them. And I ended up getting tapped to lead that. But it was really cool for the squadron because it was a big named operation, and it was really the one that we did for that deployment, which, knowing what happened later, seems ridiculous that we were excited about one real named op, but that was just the very beginning of the Marine Corps really getting settled and starting to fight the insurgency. So it was a fun one to fly. It was neat.
Yeah, I mean, people got to remember that that's after the country's been taken over. Now they got to establish where are we best fit, for like putting troops here for whatever reason. I'm sure there was a lot of like wrangling at the political level of like different assets in different places and stuff like that, and then actions on the ground, what needed to be placed where, I mean, because people got to remember too. I know in Afghanistan we really were always concerned about putting FOBs, forward operating bases, and combat outposts, and maintaining them within like the golden hour of of care. So that means if someone gets injured, we can have a helo to them and then be medevac within that hour time frame. And so that those kind of decisions you have to make, and so that's what was going on, right? They were just settling like final locations for different bases and where we can best support areas from whatever. That's kind of a weird time to be there, right? Because it is kind of a transition period from from an invasion force to a nation building or whatever kind of force.
Yeah, and when we were there the first time, we're fighting the Iraqi army and the Republican Guard, and then we come back for this one. We're setting up, and we're going to be fighting this insurgency, if you will, which as a country was something we'd done before, but it had been a while.
Mm-hmm.
So, just as a force, all the generals up on high had come home and were dusting off the Vietnam era tactics and researching, hey, how do we do this again? And just really starting to form the plan for the way forward. And so there was those first few months in Iraq where that hadn't quite trickled all the way back down to us yet, but it did. So they're at the tail end of that deployment. It was like, okay, here's how we're going to go about this now.
Did the air threats differ much from your first deployment to your second deployment?
Well, just I would say all of call it the big stuff was really no longer an issue. In the initial deployment, there were CSU-23 TAC-4s and all kinds of other forms of AAA and bigger things that were out there in the battle space. And thankfully, our buddies in the Cobras, for the most part, took care of those things. So by the time we got back the second time in Iraq, it really it was for most part small arms, man pads, shoulder fired, man portable air defense, and things like that. So that was really what we were concerned with and contending with that second time around.
Yeah. Now, I mean, did you guys have any aircraft that had taken shots from like small arms or anything? Did you ever come back and count the bullet holes?
Very, very little in that second trip to Iraq. But the third one we went on was a lot more lively. Yeah. So it was, which I think was just the nature of the deployments and the mission and what we were doing at the time.
Now, I believe in the book you said when you guys went to that third deployment, you relieved a Marine squadron that had lost a 53, correct?
Yeah, so one of our sister squadrons was there in the rotation ahead of us, and it was getting towards the tail end of their deployment in January, and we were supposed to head out there in March. But it was tough flying low light level out there. It's hard to pick up a horizon low light level, and I myself often would get, you get vertigo, you get what's called the leans, where you feel like you're in a turn, but you're not. It used to commonly happen just coming off the runway at Al Asad, like almost every single time. Those first few seconds, it would kind of take your body a few seconds to adjust. But they had a flight of 2 aircraft that was heading out to a FOB called Korean Village. Crappy night, a lot of dust in the air, hot boobs kicking up. And, so there's no horizon, and they had what's called a controlled flight into terrain incident, where they just literally flew the aircraft into the ground because they became disoriented, and lost 31 total Marines in that mishap, with everyone in the back. So it was a huge blow to the Marine Corps, to the community, obviously to that squadron and all of those families that were affected. But for our unit, again, we were the guys, that were in the chute to go next. And that was a very sobering thing for us, and the aircraft commander of that aircraft was actually a friend of mine, a pretty good friend of mine. Randomly, we'd gone to college together, and we didn't know each other in college. We figured that out in flight school. And he had started out in our squadron. So he was in our squadron on my first deployment, and then cross-decked over to HMH 361, and ended up there, obviously, in that squadron for that deployment. And we lost that crew that night.
Yeah, that sucks, man. It's such a sanitized way of saying it, the controlled flight into terrain. Anytime I hear someone say that, it's like such a weird phrase to hear,
It is.
It is. It's such a bureaucratic way of saying they crashed. And it's like, man, like.
Yeah. And, we felt terrible for those guys, and they didn't fly at night for a little while after that. Higher headquarters just scaled back their night tasking. They had just started flying at night again a little bit right before we got there and took over a couple months later there in early March. But I remember being there, turning over with them. And, we all know each other. The flight line at Miramar is small, and all the pilots, especially in the squadrons, know one another. And you got a lot of friends in the other squadron. So I felt bad turning over for them. You could tell that had hit their unit really hard, understandably. The challenge, I think, for us and for me, because by that point I was the senior captain in the squadron, I was the WTI, was just trying to help all of our younger pilots not be too affected by that, because I knew like, hey, we're gonna have to get back on this horse and we're gonna need to get out there at night, and that's what we're here to do. And at that point, the Marine Corps and everybody really had figured out this is how we're fighting an insurgency. So it was a lot more kinetic. There were going to be a lot more named operations. It was going to be a very busy deployment for us. So kind of getting everyone to shake that off, if you will, and settle in for our unit was a little bit of a challenge also.
Man, you keep walking into these deployments right after squadrons are losing helos, and it's just like you're on a bad foot. Like it feels like you're starting like, all right, guys, morale's low starting off. Let's kind of,
Yeah, it was just by virtue of luck, if you will, that I was in the unit I was in HMH 465, and we did those three deployments in succession. And by that third one, the only guys left the only pilots left in the squadron that had also been there for the first one were me and one of my really good friends, Dave Payne. And we were the only two captains in the squadron that were on our fourth deployment, which was highly unusual at the time. Before all the war started, it was rare for a captain to do three deployments. Mm-hmm. No one had done four. So we were doing a fourth deployment, third in a row to Iraq. But at that point, we were pretty seasoned. I mean, we'd essentially been over there fighting and flying for a couple of years almost. So we were ready to go. And we had some really strong, younger pilots in our squadron. CO, he was good in the aircraft. And we had some pretty solid majors. So we had a good team going into that one in 2005.
And you guys basically went right into night flying, right? You said the last squadron had not been, so you guys rolled right into it?
Yeah, they started flying a little bit again at night. But as soon as we took the mission, a higher headquarters, I'd gone up and talked to them. As a squadron WTI, I was really the primary liaison. And there was a major up there on staff, awesome guy, Bullwinkle Glasgow. Retired as a colonel years later, but he was a major at the time. And he was like, he just asked me, he's like, hey, you guys ready to go? And I was like, yes, sir. Just let us know what you need. Like full tasking, let's get on it. And, we started scheduling, normal day crew, night crew. And right out of the gate, started doing named operations and inserts at night and extracts. And that ended up being a really busy, really interesting deployment.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, I want to acknowledge you said there that you were the squadron WTI, so you did get to go back to the course.
I did.
How does that, can you walk us, I mean, you don't have to go in depth about the course or anything because you already kind of explained it, but how did you feel coming away from that kind of training, especially knowing you're rolling right into a deployment?
Yeah.
One, and two, how did your responsibilities within the squadron change now as a WTI?
It was great. That had been my goal for a long time. And like I said earlier, that it worked out, say, better for me that I didn't go when I was supposed to originally, because I did one more deployment prior to going. By the time I went, I'd already done three deployments. I was cruising past 1,200 flight hours. Like I was a very experienced captain to be showing up as a student at WTI.
Mm-hmm.
At least had a few hundred more hours and one more deployment than most people who come in there for the course. So I was very well prepared for it, and the course went very well for me, which really kind of set up a bunch of stuff that happened for me later. But going back to the squadron, I felt just very comfortable in my role. And as the squadron WTI, you're really responsible for being what's called the pilot training officer. So the overall training of the squadron is your responsibility. You're the primary person building the training plan. Now, granted, you're working for an operations officer who's a major, who's senior to you, but it's really your job, to make sure that stuff's right. And then anything that's tactical that comes up in nature, you're not necessarily flying all of those yourself, but you're ensuring that you have the right mix of crews and the crews are capable, and you're doing a lot of them yourself. So you're kind of, the way I always describe it to people is the squadron WTI captain is like your quarterback in the squadron. That he's that guy, and that's really the expectation.
Now, when you went to school, you said you had hundreds of flight hours more than a lot of the guys. When you come with that much more experience, are the instructors expecting that much more from you?
A little bit. It was actually a very interesting time to go to WTI because I wasn't alone. Like the other students in my class, at least in the 53 students that went through the class, we're all similar. Mm-hmm. We had all deployed to combat at least once, if not twice. We all had a few more hours than what had traditionally been typical for WTI. But the really interesting aspect of it was the instructors there at WTI at MOTS 1 are really considered to be the best of the best, like in the entire community. It's, invitation only to go there and be an instructor. But by virtue of the fact that most of them were already there when the war started, they actually had less combat experience than the students did in that class.
Mm-hmm.
And that created a very interesting dynamic at times in that class. And, we weren't like overtly jerks about it. Maybe a couple of times, but there were a couple of times in the class where it got a little testy in a debrief, where one of the instructors would say something and one of the students would pop off and be like, well, in combat, we do it this way.
In the real world.
Yeah, stuff like that. So it definitely got a little tense at times, but that was just a byproduct of what was happening in the Marine Corps as a whole, really, and everybody's timing.
Yeah. I mean, it's my understanding that the instructors at WTI are like eating up debriefs when there's like combat situations going on and stuff like that. Cause they have to be the guys that know everything. Right. So they're pretty well informed of what you guys are doing in country, right?
100%. I mean, every single one of them was a rock star. I think every single one of them went on to be a commanding officer. I mean, they were great dudes. It was just virtue of timing, and a couple of them had gotten to do OF1. They'd all, for the most part, augmented squadrons in OF1 and at least got a few flights in. But, smart ass younger captains, we were like, hey, we're road dog. We did couple full deployments over there. What are you guys talking about?
I can imagine
reading books.
I can imagine a cat. Yeah, shut up, nerd. Back in my day.
It was a really interesting time to go through. But the class went well. I mean, it's an ass kicker. I'm not gonna lie. That 6 weeks is intense, and I was glad to get it done. But it went well for me.
I've always heard that. I've always heard it's for all students, because what people may not know is when it's going on, it's a huge exercise, and it's like all the 53 pilot WTI students, the Cobras, Hueys, they bring in a 160th guy they trade or bring him in for, I don't know, whatever.
Yep.
They have ground element guys out there. There's arty guys. It's a whole thing, and they do these massive exercises.
Yeah.
And they do training that you can't do in other places. Like they'll let guys fire in closer than they normally would in normal training exercises.
Yeah. And so the way it's set up is kind of crawl, walk, run. But once the flight phase starts, for the first week, it's just the 53 students flying together. The second week is all the rotary wing guys doing these big rotary wing missions together. So you got the Cobras, the Hueys, at the time, the 46s mixed in. Later, we get the Ospreys, obviously. And then the last week, you go into what's called Finex, and then there's a whole fixed wing division in the building too. And now everybody's playing. And then you got the ground element. And they bring in all these assets. Like there's enemy MiGs, real ones, enemy, Russian Hind helicopters flying in these missions as adversaries, plus all of the other ground threats. Like everything is present in this training exercise. Like it's pretty awesome to see it all come together and participate in it.
Yeah, I'm jealous, man. I always wanted to go as a JTAC. The guys I knew as a JTAC that went were like, dude, it's a next level of like fires planning and stuff like that. Like it's a major course on integrating everything. Cause a lot of times the reality is a lot of your training is in theory. If we had 53s here, here's how we would do the insert. If we had this element and in that situation, everything's there and every piece of it's being utilized, and you as the expert in your field, your individual, whatever, is expected to show up and, shine.
Yeah. And essentially the way the Marine Corps is designed is every squadron is supposed to have at least one captain, company grade WTI, per detachment. So, if you kick out a detachment, you got to have a WTI there. You got to have one with your main body, whatever. So it's still not a lot of guys get to go, but it's so that you have that expertise available in every unit in country. And then obviously you always have a major or two kicking around who is a WTI and on occasion a commanding officer. But for that unit at that time, when we deployed in 2005, one of our majors had gone through the course, but I was the only company grade officer that had technically gone through the course. So it was a busy deployment for me for sure.
So let's talk about that next deployment. This is your fourth, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Third to Iraq, fourth deployment. When you mentioned in the book the task force guys came over to just engage and see what your capabilities were before putting up an official request. And I will say that is more common than people that have never done anything like that than they realize, because they're not going to waste the time of putting up a request or something for something they can't get, and they might as well just call you and be like, hey, is this even possible before we try? That's awesome that you were available and you were able to work with those guys. Can you kind of explain what they were wanting and how you guys were utilized when they would do ops?
Absolutely. So I love talking about working with those guys. At the time, it was like the coolest thing that had ever happened, as far as I was concerned as a captain. So there was a task force that had been put together at the time, and their mission was, frankly, to hunt down Zarqawi, who was the leading al-Qaeda in Iraq and was our number one target. And they were stationed on Al Assad with us, but it took us a couple of weeks to kind of figure out who they were. They had their own little compound. They sort of wore uniforms or pieces of uniforms. We'd see them in the chow hall with like hockey helmets on with NVG mounts on them. Whoever they were obviously soft and they were special. We knew that. And the Task Force 160th, which is the only aviation element that's organic to SOCOM, all Army warrant officer pilots considered to be the best helicopter pilots in the world and have earned that for certain. So they had some of their Blackhawks and Little Birds parked out right in front of their compound. But we noticed right away that their CH-47s were mysteriously absent. They didn't have any heavy lift. And it's really because at the time, the 160th was still so busy in Afghanistan with their 47s that they couldn't cover down on all the requirements, so they didn't have them there in country. So a couple weeks into our deployment, these guys come into our squadron spaces. Two of them came over, and it just happened to be my buddy Dave Payne and I. Apollo Payne were in our op shop that day. Neither of us were flying for whatever reason. These two guys come walking in. We don't really know who they are. We just know they're doing something special. And I can't even remember how they introduced themselves, but it was, like, hey, I'm Brick and this is Todd. So whoever they were, we know like these guys they're legit. But they were basically just asking us for a feasibility support for the reason you stated. They want to know if we could basically provide assault support heavy lift for them because they didn't have their 47s in country that were organic. And, it was just at the time, David and I were just a couple of captains making handshake deals that weren't really ours to make. But of course, we were like, yeah, man, we can work with you guys. What do you guys need? And they immediately told us like, well, we've got these vehicles and we want to know if we can internal them. So right away, we're like, well, go get the vehicles and come over and let's check it out. So like 10 minutes later, they pull up on our flight line, and the first few vehicles are pretty standard, a couple of like Toyota Hilux trucks. Those were a no-brainer. They had these Mad Max looking dune buggies that were pretty cool. Those were easy. And then they had this crazy like Chevy Caprice cop car that sounded like a race car. So we checked that out and determined we could get that in the aircraft too.
That's crazy that fits in the aircraft, by the way. When I read that in the book, I was like, what?
It barely fits in the aircraft. Yeah. What's interesting about this whole story that I'm telling is I had to send the manuscript for this book to the Pentagon, to the Department of Defense Office of Pre-Publication Review. And there's definitely some details that they had me remove. Nothing that like really impacted the story, but they had me remove some details about these guys because they were that special. And what they were doing at the time was, that big of a deal. But yeah, that Caprice cop car fit in there just barely. You couldn't open the doors once you were in there. So whoever was inside of it was staying inside of it throughout the duration of the ride in a 53, but it worked. And so from there, we both had to go put in official requests. And like on our end, one of the things we had to get was those loads certified to carry. But our higher headquarters was great. They helped us do that. The task force guys put in the request. There was some red tape there, obviously, for a little bit. And the Marine Corps, ultimately, what they asked us to do was what amounted to some practice missions with them where we'd load their vehicles, do a couple laps in the pattern at the base, land and unload the vehicles. Mm-hmm. And also played around with some different forms of ITG, terminal guidance that those guys had available to sparkle landing zones for us. But once we got that sorted out, then we started working with them, and it was so fun because, we're basically helping out with missions that would typically be 160th guys, Night Stalkers flying. And instead we had, Marine Corps 53 squadron out there playing with those guys. It was great.
Yeah. That's an awesome time. That's, was there like, I imagine some of the red tape was bringing out like load masters or something to figure out how to like strap these things down when they're in the helos, and like how do you can actually even carry them?
No, like we had figured that out pretty quick, and we still had some pretty sharp guys in our unit that were able to help.
Yeah.
So, but it was really had to do with approval authority and how the requests were going to work, and if the Marine Corps was going to say be willing to carve out sorties that would have otherwise gone to call it our normal stuff, support the organic Marine units there.
Yeah.
And then your standard, safety factor of make sure these vehicles can get in and out safely, et cetera. So we basically just had to check some boxes and prove that what we were talking about conceptually was doable. And then it was off to the races once we got that part done.
And that's the way it works. I mean, people may not, it's funny you said captain making deals that you're probably not.
Yeah.
That made me laugh because that made me, so when I was on my 11th MU deployment on my second one, I was the watch officer and I was the fires guy in the LFOC, and I got a phone call and it was like, "Hey, this is Tom. I'm with a task force. I'm wondering if you guys could support." And he was the same thing. He was like, "What's the feasibility of this?" He's like, "We're trying to get some artillery support in here because they're getting ready to do that major push against ISIS in Syria and stuff." And he's like, "You think you could, we could get like 1 or 2 guns and maybe pull them behind like dump trucks?" And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "I mean, yeah, you could. I don't know if we can allow it. I mean, I don't know what the."
Yeah.
And I got with my captain, Captain Burton at the time. I think he's a major now, and he did all the back channel deals and stuff. I think he may have been ashore, or he went ashore right after. And that's how we ended up with Marine artillery in Syria. And we ended up sending like a few guns and like almost, I think a whole battery maybe to Syria. And they ended up doing fire support that whole time. And then we left and another Marine unit came in, and that was on the news because they had shot out their barrels. They had shot so many rounds that they had to get new barrels for some of the howitzers. And there was also, I wish the combat camera made this sick video. One of the probably first drone videos that they were making with combat camera of them shooting in artillery. And people were like, "Oh, we got Marine artillery in Syria?" And it's like, yeah. And but when you saying that made me reminded me of that, where it was a phone call and it was like, "Hey, what do you think?" And we kind of hashed over some details. I kind of gave them like a big picture of what could happen and what couldn't happen for sure. And then after that, it's when I went to my captain and the OPSO and was like, "Hey, this guy named Tom called. He's from the task force." And that's literally how it is. "Hey, it's Bob. This is Bob." And you're like, "Hey, Bob."
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I loved working with those guys. And it really just escalated from there all the way up until we ended up doing Operation Matador with them, which was really a huge one. It was fun to end up getting to fly as well.
Can you talk about any of the operations you did with those guys? Like give us some like how your roles in it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was what they were doing was a lot of, what we call raids. And it was really all based on, because they had this primary target, was really trying to catch people that could help them figure out where he was going to be and ultimately catch him. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, we're just flying raids where they're trying to go get a guy. Mm-hmm. And so, they'd show up on our flight line with, their Toyota Hilux trucks with, it sometimes just looked like someone had just dumped a pile of guns and ammo in the back. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Homemade ladders out of 2x4s, Zodiac boats strapped to the bed of the truck. And we go insert them. Yeah, we go insert them, usually with a little bit of standoff from the actual target. Yeah. And then they take off in their vehicles and boats and do whatever they needed to do to get across the river and go try to grab this person. But it was ultimately one of the raids that our squadron flew with them, and it was my buddy Dave Payne actually that flew it. But they went and snatched a target that ultimately ended up providing the intel that led to Operation Matador, which was all about trying to get the leader of Al Qaeda there, the number one target in Iraq. And so going into Operation Matador felt like, to us at the time, like it was this huge thing. It was like, we're finally going to get this dude, and the Marine Corps is playing in it. Right. So, but the truth is, all they'd really asked for from us initially was 253s to put a blocking force of Marines basically on the on the Syrian border, kind of on the northwest corner of town.
Mm-hmm.
And typical Marine Corps fashion, that ballooned into a battalion insert. And, as a young captain, I remember thinking like, oh, here we go. Like we got to get every Marine in this damn desert involved in this mission to say we were involved in it. So we spent a few days planning this battalion insert. It was ridiculous. Meanwhile, the 160th guys who were there, the Black Hawk guys, the Little Birds were like, look, man, we're going to make a Rawahs around the city and just stay the hell out of our way, which is easy. We're like, okay, got it. Yeah, no sweat. We'll stay out of your way for what they were doing. But eventually cooler heads prevailed. It went back down to a flight of just 253s, and it ended up being my buddy Dave who flew it. And it was super cool. But I remember at the time thinking like, this is like the biggest, craziest, most exciting mission I'll ever be a part of as a 53 guy. It was neat.
That same kind of thing happened when we brought this artillery thing up on the Mew. I put it up. I go, hey, OPSO, this is what they're looking for: 2 cannons, a minimal skeleton crew to run them, and they'll secure dump trucks to pull them. And everybody was on ship, and everybody wanted to get off ship, and the BLT commander wanted to go ashore as well. And it became like he would refuse to do anything unless at least a company of Marines went, of his guys with Cat and all this stuff. And then it went from like wanting 2 guns to like ballooning up, like you said, to a full battery reinforced with like, it was hundreds of guys. And if you're an officer listening to this, you don't know, they were so close to losing that mission because they were like, dude, what? You guys want all this shit? Like, we're trying to have a minimal footprint. You come in, shoot some artillery, and that's it. And these guys were talking about wanting to go on patrols and do all this stuff. And it was like, dude, that's not, you're trying to create missions out of this thing. They're gifting us this mission, and you're about to fuck it away.
Totally.
So something to consider if you're an officer and that comes across your desk sometime.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, everyone wants to play, right? But it definitely got a little ridiculous there for a few days, but then we got it back in the box and went and executed. It was good.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Anytime you work with like the task force guys, it's like, man, there's like, these guys get to do whatever. It's like, it seems like we got to do a couple things with them on ship, and I remember working just doing different stuff with them and working with their JTAC and being like, man, you guys got all the stuff. Like, you guys, what capability don't you have?
They do. They're so well taken care of. But I mean, they're rock stars. Those guys get all the adoration they get for a reason. I mean, they're the best.
They're underpaid professional athletes, is what they're doing.
Basically, yeah, they're incredible. The stuff they can do is incredible. It was always fun working with them.
A lot of those dudes are on. I mean, if you've never worked around special operations people, a lot of those dudes athletically are on like collegiate professional level, if not close to Olympic level athletes. I remember my neighbor was a MARSOC operator, and he would wake up at like 4 a.m. and he would be out there biking in his garage. He had to set up so he could bike in his garage. He'd bike forever for like a while, and then he'd go run for miles and come back and bike more. And he would do these Ironman, the ultra marathon stuff. And I'm like, dude, you're a maniac. Like, that's but you kind of have to be at that level that he's wanting to be at. So
those guys are studs
for sure. That's always cool though. I was, when you were saying that you were supporting them, I assumed that you would be either dropping dudes off and way offset from the actual target, or dropping off dudes in a blocking position, because obviously we're not bringing in 53s to fast rope dudes on top of rooftops. If we're doing that, things may have gone wrong.
Yeah, it's gone horribly wrong if we've gone to that, for sure.
Yeah,
it was fun.
I mean, how often were you working with them compared to your conventional missions that you still have to take care of?
We were still working with them regularly. So I would say it was almost a once, twice a week we were doing something in support of them. But what was really cool was, up to that point as 53 squadrons, we hadn't done a lot of named operations. OF1, totally different fight, conventional force like we talked about. And in OF2, we only really did that one at the end in Rawah. But as we took over, things got going with the task force. I don't know exactly how this worked, but just we started getting more and more requests. My assumption was always that kind of the word got out of like, hey, these 53 guys over here are okay. You know, they know what they're doing.
They're
They're good
legit.
to work with. And so we started getting other requests from like adjacent units, you know, army units for inserts. And of course we're supporting all the Marines in country. And so it got busy to where we got on this pace where we were doing 2, 3 named ops a week, which was for us at the time seemed wild. And I remember thinking at the time, like, no 53 squadron's ever done named ops at this pace, and no one probably ever will again. And by the time the deployment ended, we were at 68. And I know that because I was tracking them as a squadron WTI as we were doing them and making sure we had the right crews and all that stuff, and flew a lot of them personally. Throughout that. So we did 68. And I remember thinking, like, no one's ever going to beat that number. This was just like this bizarre moment in time where the task force guys were here, their 47s weren't. I'm sure they'll finish, you know, get some bandwidth back in Afghanistan soon, and they'll be out here, and that'll kind of be the end of that. Little did I know that a few years later, I would completely adjust my perspective again. But at the time, I remember thinking, like, that was it. That was the pinnacle. And it felt like the coolest thing I'd ever been a part of. And it was just an awesome way for me to wrap up that, you know, for my 4th deployment, 3rd to Iraq. I was a squadron WTI. We did all these cool things. It was a great feeling professionally, for sure.
I mean, had you guys shit the bed on that, that may have been the most that a 53 squadron, you know, that going and working with those dudes and working with anybody really and doing a really good job puts that in their mind for later on, and they go, hey, those 53 guys are actually kind of legit. I worked with them on the last deployment.
Yeah.
Let's bring them in on this thing too if they're available.
Yep.
You know, so it's key for people to remember that, like, people are always watching, and if you do a shitty job, they understand that. And if you're not getting missions later on, maybe it's because part of it might be because, you know, how you kind of carried yourself on those previous missions.
100%. And every individual squadron that's deployed during their time is representing that for the community at large, right? Because whatever happens reflects on the whole community, and the 53s in general get a reputation, if you will, good or bad, based on what happens. So it was awesome to be part of that.
Well, you fly an aircraft called a shitter. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you're starting like at a -1 already. People are like, wait, is this thing going to crash on me?
Well, like we talked about last time, you know, flying a self support period is never going to be considered cool or exciting or anything. So getting to start doing some of that stuff and doing it well was pretty awesome.
How did how did working with those dudes so much affect your assault support mission that you're supposed to be doing while you're in Iraq?
We were still able to do it. I mean, because we actually, like all 53 squadrons in combat, we had a 24-hour rotation going. So we had crews flying during the day and crews flying at night. So most of the standard ASRs, we always called it hauling ass and trash, was happening during the day. So we were still able to cover down on all that. The competition, if you will, was really between them and the other organic Marine Corps units for the night missions, because most of the named ops would happen at night. And when I say night, you know, you'd come in at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, or no, you know, 21, 2200, fly all night until the sun comes up. And a lot of these raids and stuff would happen right around 2 a.m., 3 a.m. So whoever was on the night page was typically doing the named operations. And that was really the only trade-off for the Marine Corps. So I'm sure a couple of times they ended up prioritizing the task force over something else the Marine Corps was trying to do organically.
Now, did you have like set pilots that would work with the task force, or everybody got in on it?
Well, it was really just, it's crew composition, but we had our most qualified pilots, I would say, were the ones that were primarily working with them and executing the flights. So, you know, you have all your quals. I think we talked about it last time, but up at the top is obviously your weapons and tactics instructors. And then the one just below that is night systems instructors. So guys who are night systems instructors but haven't gone through the WTI course, but they're pretty damn close to being similar. In some cases, there's probably guys who never went to WTI that are better than a WTI that are night systems instructors. But we had enough of those in the unit that's really who did it. So for the most part, it was our majors, our commanding officer, and then, you know, me and my buddy Dave and like one or two other captains that were night systems instructors that were doing the majority of this stuff.
That's awesome. On the night crew. Now there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity for I know Cobra guys can possibly get a slot at the 160th. Is there any way for a 53 pilot to move over there and get a rotation through?
No, but at the time, back then there was an exchange tour available with the 20th Special Operations Squadron, which was an Air Force PAVE 53 Special Ops contingent that did deploy and do a lot of stuff with the 160th. And so we had a single Marine 53 pilot that was always doing exchange tour of the 20th Special Operations Squadron. And because of what happened on our deployment in 2005, myself, and I mentioned him before, my buddy Dave Payne and I, Apollo, we were the senior captains, and we were doing most of the interfacing with the task force, whether we were flying the mission or not. We were kind of the primary points of contact. But at the conclusion of that deployment, Dave actually applied for and got selected to go do that 20th Special Operations Squadron exchange tour. So when we left, after that last deployment, came home and we're wrapping up our time in the squadron, that's what he went and did. And he was great. So, he really enjoyed that. And he went and did several of the short deployments with the operators in the 20th SOS.
Is there a big difference between the 53 you flew and then the ones that they use?
Yeah, for sure. A Pavlo is just the older variant, not quite as powerful, but has a lot more technology on it, or had a lot more technology on it, was my understanding. I never flew a Pavlo, but everything I know about it was just my buddy Dave telling me about it later. But definitely a slightly different machine, but pretty cool, and they had a really cool mission as well.
I forgot they even had that squadron, that there was another Special Operations Squadron like that.
Yeah, they had it for a while, and then I don't remember the year that they folded it up. Dave might have actually been the last one. I don't remember if there was one more guy that did that exchange tour after him or not, but I think, we got home in late 2005, the fall of 05. I think it was spring of 06 where he went out there for about 3 years. So somewhere around 2009, 10, I think is when they shut that unit down.
Were they mainly used to like reinforce the 160th, or did they have something completely different missions?
I honestly at the time didn't have a good enough understanding to say for certain. I do know that towards the end of that 2005 deployment, they showed up. And when they did, we thought, okay, we're probably done supporting these guys because the Pavlos are here now. And literally, I think it was the next week, they crashed a Pavlo doing a mission with those guys. Yeah. The Pavlo showed up and promptly crashed an aircraft. And our squadron actually got tapped to go recover that aircraft, external lift it and get it out of there. And so it was actually our commanding officer that flew it. I was very involved in the planning for it, which came in handy later, but we put together a plan for him. We had the math and everything dialed in to go externally lift it, executed right at sunrise, which is the coldest time of the day, which helps with the lift. And we got it out of there. But because they promptly showed up and then crashed an aircraft, we stayed in business working with the task force. Because I want to say they only had 2 or 3 aircraft that they brought.
Do you know what happened? Like what brought it down?
It wasn't bad. There was no loss of life or anything on that one. It was just your classic hard landing where the gear got all jacked up and the aircraft wasn't flyable and broke it enough.
Reminiscent of your first deployment.
Yeah, similar. A little worse, that it had to actually be recovered and they couldn't fly it away. But yeah, so they all walked away, but the aircraft was broken enough that it needed a recovery.
That's rough. You're kind of looking at them like, huh? First week, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
They show up, they're like, all right, nerds, we're here.
Yeah. It was like,
get back to moving mail.
Yeah, exactly. And then we went and bailed them out and kept on trucking. It was good.
That's crazy. Yeah, I've never seen one. I don't think I've ever seen one in person. I wonder, because it's like saying there's if you've seen a 47, there's a big difference between that and a 160th 47.
For sure.
And the same with the what do they call the 60? That's a special operations one.
The DAP.
The DAP. Yeah, the direct action penetrator.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between that and your normal 60. So.
For sure.
Man, that's cool stuff, though.
It was. It was a cool deployment.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you want. You want to walk away from it and be like, yeah, it was cool. Like, we got to do some cool stuff. Yep. If you are there and you're a conventional force and special operations guys ask you to help them out, it makes you feel like, oh, hell yeah, man, I'm good at what I'm doing, because they value my support, my input, my whatever here.
Yeah, it was great for our unit as a whole. I mean, and so it was awesome, for me to be in the position I was as a squadron WTI to be able to help facilitate that, kind of for all of us. But
Mm-hmm.
it made for a really cool deployment. It was action packed and exciting, and we're right there working with these super secret task force guys the whole time, and it was good. It was also just good for the community, the whole 53 community, to have a unit that was able to do that and do well.
For sure. Now, when you're like planning operations with these guys, was it different than what you're used to because it's more of a joint environment now, or?
Well, I would say it was different than what I was used to, and because of how damn efficient they were, and I
Mm,
really loved it. I mean, with them, it was like it was very simple. They would say like, here's what you need to know. We need you to drop stuff right here at this time. And that was pretty much it,
can you do
you
that?
know?
Yes.
Yeah. And then they never really briefed us on their ground scheme of maneuver too much, which was different because so typically you're playing with Marines, you have to, as the aviator, totally, or at least have a good understanding of the ground scheme maneuver and everything you're doing is in support of that. But the task force guys kept it super simple for us. They're like, we need you to insert us here at this time. And then we need you to be able to pick us up here at this time, or be ready to. And then we kind of figure it out from there and do our own routing and stuff. But it was actually very efficient working with them. And for sure, the one time we made it inefficient when we tried to turn it into a battalion insert, they were like, you know what, we're not doing this. So we're going to put a Rawahs around what we're doing and you guys stay out of our way.
Damn. Yeah. That's what happens. People want to get involved.
Yeah, totally. It was great working with them. It was so
Man.
fun.
Well, dude, this has been great. This is our second conversation. People can hear more about you still, we haven't even gone all the way through your career yet.
Yeah.
Your book will be out today when this releases, Hangar 4 on probably everywhere, right? Amazon. All those
Well,
spots.
yeah, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. Those are the easiest places to grab it. But you can also just take a look at my website. It's isaacgeely.com, and all the social links are up there. I've got buttons on there that'll take you to links to buy the book. So
Yeah, I'll put the
we're
link to
excited.
your site in my the show description. People can check that out. Social media.
Yep. Instagram is Isaac G. Lee Writer, and then Facebook is just Isaac G. Lee.
Yeah, check him out. Check my stuff out. Former Action Guys, Former Action News on Instagram, and my website is jkramergraphics.com. Man, I really appreciate it. Round two. I think that really good
Of
conversation.
course. Yeah, it's fun. I love coming on and chatting with you. It goes by quick.